Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 433rd New Social Environment. I'm Nick Bennett, the Special Projects Editor here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a special NSE celebrating the 17th anniversary of the review panel produced by David Cohen of Artcritical. We're thrilled to welcome David Brody, Karen E. Jones, Sharmistha, Barry Schwabsky, Christopher Stackhouse, Robert Storr, Lilly, Marjorie, Welish, and Alexi Wirth, all in conversation moderated by David Cohen. We're also grateful to have the poet Glynnis Eldridge here, who will read to close today's program. A few notes before we get started. Here at the Rail, we're celebrating our 21st anniversary by working on our first ever endowment campaign. This initiative will ensure the print edition of the Rail and our public programming celebrating cross-pollination in the arts, humanities, and sciences all remains free and accessible for generations to come. Please check the chat for more information and links that we will be posting shortly. The Rail also acknowledges that Black Lives Matter and that here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We encourage you to check out the chat for a living document of resources and actions that we will be posting in a moment. And now to introduce today's host, writer David Cohen is editor and publisher of Artcritical, as well as a regular contributor. He is founder/moderator of the review panel, the Critics Forum, originally hosted by the National Academy Museum and latterly by Brooklyn Public Library, and podcast at Artcritical. He was gallery director at the New York Studio School from 2001 to 2010, and art critic and contributing editor at the New York Sun from 2003 to 2008. Born in London and educated at the University of Sussex at the Courtauld Institute of Art, David wrote for leading newspapers and magazines in England and around the world before emigrating to the United States in 1999. And here to introduce today's event is artist, writer, and independent curator Phong H, who is the publisher and artistic director here at the Rail, also of the River Rail, Rail Editions, and Rail curatorial projects. From 2007 to 2010, he served as curatorial advisor at MoMA PS1. So to kick off today's event, Phong, over to you.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I'm always taught that everything we do in any creative discipline, be it making a work of art, writing a poem, or in our case, is writing about art, is perpetually being caught between what Edward Young, or my favorite poet, who once proclaimed that we're all born originals. Why is it that so many of us die as copies? And Apollinaire, if even nothing is new under the sun, the new spirit does not refrain from discovering new profundities in all this that is not new under the sun. As we all know, great art is never isolated as an outcome. The concept is always been an ideological community, a collective movement based on a larger, I would say, governing intellectual premise. Many of us would agree that this community has always been the creation of artists, of writers who are dedicate their lives to the vocation of art. Our works, which undoubtedly appeal to our sense of, I would say, hard-won freedom, result from having been receptive to life experience without succumbing to the dangers of obedience and adhering to dogma whatsoever. We surrender only to the calling of our journeys. We follow John Keats' famous term, negative capability. We can think without the banister. We can walk up and down the staircase without having the need to rest in our hands on the handrail. We can live and work under great anxieties and uncertainties, among other difficult circumstances. Yet we never fail to invoke with great certitudes the soul of the era in which we were made. What we've been experiencing in the last few decades with increasing globalization, where boundaries are constantly being broken down along with constant and endless distraction from technological spectacles, which can be useful tools for demagogues' exploitations to their mobilization of speed for power. And we have observed in the last 4 years, especially, we have no choice but to stepping up the plate, so to speak, to be the counter frictions against the machine through the means of the slowness of culture. It's here the rail that we share deep affinity with Artcritical. Not only we both launched our living organism 21 years ago, which is true, we both pretty much follow Tom H's editorial vision of art news in the heydays by inviting academics, art historians, writers writing alongside with poets and practicing artists in these 3 back-to-back review panels here. For example, Barry Schwabsky, our friend, is a poet and writer. Alexi Wirth, Robert Storr, Sharmistha, David Brody are artists and writers. Lilly, Karen E. Jones, maybe our writer through and through. Marjorie Welish and Christopher Stackhouse, who are artists, poets, and writers. And lastly, our moderator, David Cohen, is an art historian who is also, as we all know, publisher and editor and writer of Artcritical. I have always relished Willem de Koonin's wit and humor, who once say, for example, for milk to become yogurt, it needs culture. It's definitely a product of being an immigrant, I think, having a unique perspective on America, certainly New York City, as have many among his peers, including Philip Guston, Heather Stern, Louise Nelverson, Sol Steinberg, Philip Roth, Anna Aaron, Maya Shapiro, Adorno, and 100,000 of their generation, possibly millions in our generation. Similarly, I think that David has his own wit and humor, and he is to be seen as a continuum of that lineage. This is to say, many of us would hope that we didn't come to the US to exploit this nation's wealth, but rather to work so hard for our newly found freedom so we can each can contribute to this culture, the well-being of this fragile experiment of what we call democracy. In this instant, it's a good example indeed for all of us coming together, the Rail and Artcritical, coming together to amplify our social intimating, not social distancing. Yes, we are gathering here to celebrate the review panel's 17th year anniversary. We are here to celebrate the act, the art of writing and talking about art. Just as artists are given their own negative capability and inner freedom to channel art from the past, as well as the present, writers, we writers, I'm sure those writers here with us on the review panel can do the same with writing as their own way to keep this visual culture alive and relevant to the written words. Yes, the function of art writing and criticism, in addition to ennobling the spirit and elevating the mind, were expressed so eloquently by Paul Valery. I'd like to read it for you now. All the arts lit by words, each work of art demands its response, and the urge that drives man to create, like the creation that results from this strange instinct, is inseparable from a form of literature, whether written or not, whether immediate or premeditated, may not be the prime motive of any work, be the wish to give rise to discussion, if only between the mind and itself. Please join me to welcome the extraordinary David Cohen. The mic's over to you, David.
I can hear the applause in spirit, but what my ears are ringing with is the generosity, erudition, and sincerity of Fong's words. Phong, as much as Zoom allows, I come over to your studio with all those wonderful pictures on the wall. I've just got a couple here behind me, and I'm not allowed to move my head to show them to you in any detail because that unleashes a terrible light bulb behind my head. But we're in the company here of Kitai and Uchiyama. And I'd just like to say how extraordinarily generous this gesture is, that we don't need to look for a venue to celebrate our 17th anniversary. The date is etched in my mind because, oops, I moved the head. My little dog, who's here, actually, can we see? Can she be seen? I hope she can. Yes. Well, it's on an old lover's blanket that's left behind. So that red triangle there has a brown blob in the middle of it. No, at the bottom of it. That is Allegra, who was 6 months of age when she came into my life in October of 2004, and has furnished countless passwords with all that data ever since. But Allegra is the same age as the review panel, so we know that the review panel is 17 years and 1 month old. She's not the same age, sorry. Our relationship is the same age. You have to add 6 months for her, but that's probably more information than we need on the canine front. I was wandering around the Whitney yesterday looking at Jennifer Packer's fabulous show on the top floor, when my date was very impressed that people kept coming up to me and saying that they're going to tune in today, or they saw that this was happening. And one person said, it's quite a marathon, isn't it? Having 3 panels with effectively 9 critics on it all at once. And I thought, marathon, that sounds tiring. Who wants a marathon? And I said, I managed to come up with a decent line. I said, no, it's not a marathon, it's a relay race. The baton is passed on each turn. So thank you, Brooklyn Rail, for hosting us. We're supposed to be rivals in this vicious capitalist economy, and yet we are not. We are colleagues and friends and co-workers in the fabulous ongoing challenge of unpacking culture and edging it in one direction or another with our criticism. So let's get down to business. We are reviewing the review panel. I would always say at a review panel, who is here for the first time? Well, and they'll then explain the format. But on today, we're all here for the first time, most especially myself, and seeing what it's like to have 3 review panels within an hour. So that's what we're going to endeavor to do. And we've got to better get going. It's 1:17, which is, of course, highly significant, this being the 17th anniversary. So we have ahead of us 3 separate review panels looking at 4 exhibitions. What we'll do, the format is as follows. With each review panel, there'll be a little movie to remind those who haven't been able to see it, or to show those who haven't been able to see it, intimate for those who haven't been able to see it, the exhibitions that we're reviewing. We're staying true to the original remit of Artcritical, which is to review current exhibitions, unified bodies of recent work, current exhibitions of living artists in the New York City area. And our first port of call will be David Nolan Gallery, where Sharmistha Ray, Barry Schwabsky, and Marjorie Welish are joining me for a review of this exhibition. So Nick, if you could please share with us all the Vimeo of Rockburne's exhibition. Dorothea Rockburne, Giotto's Angels and Knots, is the artist's debut solo exhibition with David Nolan Gallery, which she's joining in her 89th year. This comes after a decade of landmark exhibitions for the artist, a retrospective at the Parish Art Museum in 2011, a drawing survey at MoMA a few years later, and an important ongoing display unveiled in 2018 at Deer Beacon. In some ways, the geometric purity of the squares and rectangles in solid colour and circular forms in copper wire at David Nolan recall the relatively austere and post-minimal aesthetic of her early process-informed work of the 1970s. But this body of work also recalls, in an almost theatrical way, Rockburne's formative experience of Giotto's Arena Chapel in Padua, with the walls of parts of the gallery painted ultramarine blue. In another departure, the show includes Rockburne's first two sculptures, Reflections and Interchange, put together from factory-new commonplace objects. These assemblages both feature rope arranged in trefoil knots that allude both to the arches in the Zgrovini Chapel and knot theory in the new mathematics that invariably underwrite Rockburne's aesthetic investigations. Thank you. I'm thanking myself, I guess. No, I'm thanking the Rail for broadcasting myself. Thank you, Nick. Great. So Barry, Sharmistha, and Marjorie. Barry Schwabsky, Artcritical of the Nation, co-editor of the International Reviews section of Art Forum, a prolific essayist. Essays in current exhibitions include those on Ron Gorchov showing at Tryman Reed, and Thomas Noskowski and Jane Freilicher in a two-person show curated by Eric Brown at the Resnick Pavlov Foundation. He's also, of course, a poet, and his latest volume, Feelings of And, is forthcoming from Black Square Editions in 2022. Sharmistha Ray, she is an artist, writer, and educator of Indian extraction, raised in the Middle East. Like me and Barry, an immigrant to these shores, she exhibited her abstract futures tarot at the 2021 Armory show with the feminist collective to which she belongs. She and is a founder. She's a writer whose writings have occasionally appeared in Artcritical and who we can see perhaps more often at Art Asia Pacific and Hyperallergic. And she also teaches at the Parsons School of Design and at the School of Art at Carnegie Mellon. And Marjorie Welish, an artist and a renowned critic and poet and essayist and editor. As an artist, she recently received her second Pollock-Krasner Award. And as a writer, besides having forthcoming reviews and Artcritical, she also writes for the British publication, where, funny enough, Marjorie, I published my first serious criticism that Art Monthly. Great. Okay. Thank you very much to all. Yes. And one correction. Yes. Regarding Sharmistha Ray is that they are, did I not mention this, on the faculty of the Parsons School of Design. Okay, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Give us a virtual round of applause for that. and welcome our speakers. Marjorie, let me turn to you first, in the first instance. I made the assertion in the film that the recent body of work may remind us of the cooler reserve of the earlier process work with which we're familiar from the 1970s with Dorothea Rockburne. Implication being that there's a sort of synthesis in the work in which the antithesis of those austere early works, I call them austere because they're chromatically more streamlined, but the absent presence would be the very deeply saturated color and painterliness of her more astronomical images. What do we make of that? What do you make of that, if I may ask? Do you buy that sort of dialectic reading?
I may proceed at a tangent to the question, if I may. I see this current work in terms of a fundament that does go back to drawing which makes itself from 1972-73. But here, more explicitly and numerously, Dorothea Rockburne shows collections or inventories of materials, which she explicitly states in the descriptions of the materials that are captioned to it. But for the three bodies of work, though they look different in certain respects, and including the color, I see collections of materials and substances, primarily through layering, which binds them all.
Fantastic. Sharmistha, would you go along with that characterization? What would you, what is there something specific you would add to that in order to get our bearings with Dorothea Rockburne?
Yeah, first of all, of course, I enjoyed the show. It's the artist's first show in New York, I believe, after 10 years in terms of being a gallery show. I saw, and as much, the same way I see a lot of abstraction, just kind of having lived not only in the United States, but around the world, but really through the, kind of frames of not only abstraction in terms of form, but also form and material, but also through the lenses of language, and history, and specifically a kind of cultural history. So for me, of course, there's, as Marjorie said, these kind of formal elements, which in a way are quotations of different bodies of work that Dorothea Rockburne has done, and really now in kind of these more intimate frames, just kind of referring to the scale. And I actually saw, for me, there were actually 4 bodies of work, or 4 series within, this exhibition. One, of course, being kind of the trefoil knots, those paintings, and then being kind of the chapel-like room with the blue collages, the Giotto works, kind of the homage, if I can say that, to Giotto. And then, of course, the sculptures. And within that, I was particularly interested in the blue collages, in terms of their, in terms of these quotations, because they really kind of seemed to reference, again, different bodies of work, the more kind of spare works, chromatically spare works of the 1970s, the astronomical works, of course, there is the kind of presence of color, but really within kind of, I would say, the primary and secondary palettes, there's a really kind of specificity in that use of color. And in terms of also kind of quoting the folding, but now through collage, and these kind of gestures, I would say, that she makes with the crayons, but really kind of a really thoughtful paring down of those elements. I was also really interested in the sculptures. I know there's kind of, we kind of exist in these silos of thinking about painting and drawing and sculpture. But for me, particularly that work Interchange directly connects back to another work she had done in 1971, which is shown at the Bike Art Gallery, which is a work Intersection. And it's interesting, those kind of two titles also are kind of playing off each other, you know? I mean, besides, of course, kind of their formal kind of, you know, them being actually sculptures in a kind of a formal way, to me, there's a direct link again, kind of looking back to this kind of formal innovation, looking at crude materials, looking at their, you know, potential and possibilities. So really, I mean, for me, there is a kind of coherence and cogency, you know, within the kind of, you know, examinations that the artist is, you know, doing within these kind of the frameworks of these four different bodies of work.
Fabulous. Barry Schwabsky, do you have a feeling of this body of work in relation to the artist's oeuvre as a whole?
Well, before I answer that, I should actually make one little correction to your introduction, because you very generously included me with you and Sharmistha among the immigrants. But actually, I'm the son of an immigrant, but I'm not an immigrant myself. So I should just specify that.
No, I was mentioning Phong. Phong.
Okay, because I thought I heard you say me, but
oh, okay.
But one of us is wrong, but it doesn't matter which. You know, I think that for someone who has been looking at Dorothea Rockburne's work for more decades now than I care to admit, though not going back to the beginning of her career, it's kind of wonderful to see how she simultaneously maintains a kind of continuity from one body of work to the next in terms of her interest in geometry and mathematics, but also in terms of materiality. How she maintains that continuity, but always surprises even those of us who've seen her work before. She's not repeating herself, and that really impressed me in this show particularly. The thing that was particularly fascinating to me about it was the use of the unseen in it. If you look at the assemblage relief sculptures that use the copper wire, you have the impression at first that you're seeing loops of copper wire, closed loops, and only after contemplating them for a bit do you realize that the hidden connections beneath the layers of particle board actually mean that these loops are being connected in ways that we can't see in order to form the knots that are part of the subject of the work. And likewise, in the two sculptures, the ropes appear at first to be simply loops of rope that have been twisted around, and you don't see that some of them, at some point, the loop goes under the kind of zinc tubs or whatever they are. And that's where the third twist comes, which is what makes it a knot. In other words, a double loop is not a knot. It can simply be untwisted. Whereas it's the, yeah, like if you look at this image that you're showing here, you can at first see how the rope that's under the tub is connected, but it is connected, and that's the third loop. So the configuration of the rope appears to be simpler and simpler than it is, and not an inextricable knot, which is actually what it is.
Yes, these sculptures were quite a departure. They took me by surprise. Dorothea participated in a roundtable discussion with me and others on the work of Alain Carilli, and I joked that I'd gotten together a painter and a poet and a musician and a this and a that, and I'd forgotten to get a sculptor. And Dorothea said, "No, don't worry, I'm now making sculpture." And here it is. And but it seems to be in a very different register and sensibility from what we're used to with Dorothea. Of course, there's the sort of literalism of her folded paper works, but there the fold is an active gesture. And here it's the finding and the placement. They remind me of works by the name's just gone. Okay, never mind. They had a somewhat arte povera feel, but more in the sort of high-end materials of, I mean, they're commonplace materials, but used in a pristine, Janis Kunelis is the name I was struggling for, a more pristine condition and not in a distressed condition. But that's neither here nor there. The point is, the artist was striving for an iteration of a three-dimensional mathematical proposition, wasn't she? That it does bring about some thought about the fact that her works are literal manifestations of states that they describe, as well as being representations or metaphors for those states. What do you feel, Marjorie? And I expect you'll answer this at a tangent, but nonetheless, I'll ask the question in eager expectation. What do you think of the relationship between the literal manifestation of what a work is doing and the sense of the image being iconic or an evocation in some way of that kind of state with regard to Marjorie?
I actually do have an answer, and it may even be straightforward for once. So the way I see, again, all of the work, but this will do, is that the fundament of placing one material atop another in layering is also the generator for displacing some of those layers, which then, as Barry has said, results paradoxically in occlusion as well as reveal. And that's how I think of Dorothea's work in this show. Moreover, I would like to add this, though this goes against Barry's statement in one respect. I do believe that Dorothea's literal approach to placing materials next to and upon one another is directed toward making the sensible legible. And through legibility, some kinds, not all, some kinds of intelligibility.
Barry, how would you respond to that?
I'm not sure how, because I don't quite understand the difference between legibility and intelligibility. But if
well, one is readable, and the other is discernible and cognitively available.
I understand the definitions of the words. I don't understand how those definitions apply in this case.
Okay.
Yeah, I do know something about legibility. But I think more broadly, if the statement is to say that the viewer's experience has to do with perception first, which then becomes something intelligible, something that has cognitive content, that seems pretty evident. Whatever her way of working is, the receiver's way of coming from the work is clearly starting from sense perception and then making its way toward whatever the intellectual content is. But that seems normal, actually, for artworks. Not 100% always the case, but usually the case.
Yes, Sharmistha, in relation to Rockburne, the relationship of iteration and representation becomes perhaps more acute because of her claims that her works are not merely informed by mathematics and don't merely respond to mathematics and are not merely descriptions of mathematics, but that they are mathematics. She's often made this assertion that she's sort of doing math in the work, and that mathematicians might be better equipped to get it than innumerate lay people like ourselves, or myself, I'd certainly say. I'm not going to give you a math quiz, Sharmistha, but how do you negotiate the proposed mathematical content of Dorothea's work as you view it?
Yeah, well, I don't see them kind of as residing solely in mathematics. I mean, I think the artist has also spoken in interviews about how mathematics became accessible to her, specifically, her math teacher who was, started to take her on these hikes. And, it was only when she found, the presence of mathematics in nature was when she was able to access mathematics, kind of cognitively and cerebrally. And so to me, these works are very much about direct sense perception and kind of a direct experience of the world. And, within kind of, again, thinking about just historical feminist frameworks as well, I think that the artist has never shied away from using the word emotion when talking about her work. And that, even with the presence of mathematics and structure and, the formal elements for which she is known and a kind of materiality, that there is the presence of this kind of this directness, not only with one's, own interiority, but also the ways in which those kind of come out of nature, or are kind of contextualized within nature. And so, of course, these works are not representations in that sense, but I do appreciate the ways in which the artist, especially in recent times, I think it was in a conversation with maybe Robert Storr in which he was talking about, the potential for these works to also address kind of social and political, contexts and, kind of the conditions and crises of the world, the oil wars that are going on. And these are very much, for me, come out of, feminist concerns, and out of feminist dialogues. And when I say cultural history, that's what I mean. And you kind of, use the word iconic. I also want to say that, if you look at the titles of these works, she's, got Socrates in there, she's got Giotto in there. This is also, the artist is 89 years old. This is also the artist staking a claim within the Western canon of art history and saying, I am both an old master and I'm, a contemporary at the same time. I think she's saying that outright. I don't think there's any secret there. This is kind of an artist now at, kind of the height of her powers, with a long kind of history and legacy behind her, really staking her, putting her stake in the ground.
Fantastic. I'd like to point out, by the way, that I noticed that there are a number of comments in the chat. I neglected to mention, however, that we're very much hoping to receive as many comments as are forthcoming there. And it's very much a characteristic of the review panel that we do have time allotted for questions and comments, with an unusual emphasis on comments in preference to questions. We are a panel of 4 critics, but everyone in this room is or should be a critic, and therefore we just want to hear what you think. we don't, it does not have to be phrased as a question. And as we're actually nearing the end of our segment on, nearing the end of our segment on Dorothea Rockburne, I'd like to acknowledge that the artist is in fact in the audience, which is lovely to see. It used to be that I'd always beg artist friends not to come to the live events when they were being reviewed in case they were not happy with the critical results. But I think an 89-year-old in communion with Socrates and Giotto doesn't need to worry what the likes of Schwabsky, Welish, Cohen, and Ray have to say. And she may or may not, as she chooses, dip into the comments section. The format this afternoon is that after each, to round off each of the first two discussions, we'll have a quick look and see what sort of comments we have received. And at the end of the third section, we'll open it up so that people can comment on all three segments and do so live and with their own voices in real time. But so I think actually I'm just going to go back once more to Marjorie Welish, if I may, and ask you, Marjorie, how you relate to this question of the degree to which Rockburne is doing mathematics in her work rather than merely representing it or alluding to it.
In certain ways, I have to recuse myself from an ultimate answer. I see mentions, I see citations to certain topological forms and features. But I distinguish also in my understanding here between the knot that is practical and binds things together in the commonplace domain in which other standard objects are also arrayed, and the knot of combinational topology, which is, as I understand it, a very many-sided polygon that is for convenience by mathematicians drawn as a curve, and with which those lines have no dimensions at all, and yet cross over and under each other in ways that are more crucial to our understanding of mathematical knots than lashing one thing to another.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, let's have a look in the chats now. Let's see what's going on here. Right. Yes. Show bullets. Yes, yes. Good. So, a few notes to our introduction. Thank you. So, okay, that's about the rail. That's about the dog. Okay, that's very nice. 17 years old. Does the review panel have a driver's license? Barry Schwabsky asks. No, we prefer to keep it anarchic. Let's see. And there's a very nice link to Dorothea Rockburne's exhibition at David Nolan Gallery, where you can see more illustrations. Thank you very much, Anya Bernstein of the Rail, for doing that. Of Indian extraction is such a good phrase. Yes, I quite agree. Let's see.
David, sorry, while you're scanning these things, can I throw out a question that's been on my mind and that maybe the other panelists or you yourself have some thoughts about? And it's the question that's sort of been alluded to already, but it maybe hasn't been turned into a question. What about this reference to Giotto, and how much does that add to the viewer's appreciation of the work, or I have to say, in my case, I think it started out for me making me very suspicious, and luckily the work overcame my suspicions.
Good.
But
it seemed to me
yeah,
the walls were a little too dark to quite be ultramarine. They seemed to be more international Klein blue, but I don't claim to be the ultimate eye or authority on blueness. But so I mean, that's a very good question that Barry raises as to whether, in fact, we're being invited into a virginal realm with the use of the blue. Whether there is something about immaculateness that's at play. And that's certainly a very good thought for us to all dwell upon. G.E. Schwartz has given some helpful comments here, I believe. Sometimes they seem like Mobius strips, Mr. Schwartz says, metaphors into metaverse. Mathematics is such a logical method, and mathematical propositions express no thoughts. A wonderful way to sum up life, leaving detachments, Mr. Schwartz says. Seems as though, too, with these knots, the process and results are equivalent. And Brian Hamilton Chadwick points to a Vimeo for anyone interested, a short video profile of Dorothea in which she does indeed address the question of math in her work. Well, that's certainly very frequently the case when Dorothea is generous enough to share her thoughts with the public. Fantastic. Okay, so
sorry, sorry, I just want to make a quick comment. Sorry, dry cough. About what Barry was saying, just kind of about the Giotto reference, is that, what struck me in kind of reading, through, reading about Dorothea's relationship with the chapel, the Giotto chapel, is that for years she hadn't actually seen it or directly experienced it. And I might have to go, on pause because I'm suddenly developed a cough, but it also kind of ties in with these ideas of the unseen, and I'm going to leave it there because
the cough
right now
is winning. Yes, I'm sorry. To have a glass of water. Cool. I just wanted to also mention, as Sharmistha was there, that the name of the collective, the feminist art collective that they have founded with their feminist artist colleagues, is Hilma's Ghost, in reference, obviously, to the great Hilma af Klint. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you very much indeed, Barry Schwabsky, Sharmistha Ray, and Marjorie Welish. And we're now going to move on. That's a cue to Nick to prepare the movie. We're now going to move on to our second review panel, in which we are looking at the exhibition of Ron Barron and Sarah Walker at the John Molloy Gallery, Intersections. Intersections, the title of this two-artist show at John Molloy Gallery, brings together a painter, Sarah Walker, and a sculptor, Ron Barron, with surprising overlaps and concerns, despite the very different premises and approaches of each artist. Ron Barron's work of the last several years has negotiated a horrific tragedy that befell the artist and his family. His jumbled, fragmentary, totemic vase-like ceramics allude in their assembled forms to the shattered vase theory of PTSD. Sarah Walker takes a more overtly non-representational approach to the social phenomenon of informational overload. The intersecting planes and dimensions of her visually woven together systems of abstract schema evoke a sense of chaos in the attempt to represent a unified reality built out of different ways of measuring life. In the words of the gallery literature, Barron and Walker accumulate evocative surfaces, broken, perforated, infilled, and extrapolated, that interplay one with the other. Fabulous. And I'm joined in my review of this exhibition by a new team. Lilly Way, David Brody, and Alexi Wirth. So Lilly Way is really known to all of us as one of the deans of American art writing. She's a freelance writer through and through, but has managed to nonetheless accumulate a string of contributing editor statuses at Art in America and Art News among them. She is an inveterate curator as well as critic, and she wrote the lead essay in the a recent publication on Maya Lin. David Brody is a painter, filmmaker, and writer. He has exhibited on a number of occasions, solo exhibitions with Pierogi Gallery, and he is in the current group exhibition Pulp, organized by Pierogi. His films have been shown at MoMA and the National Gallery, and he has written for Cabinet and Bomb and other publications. And I almost fell out my seat when I saw in his notes that he has written for Artcritical for 20 years.
Oh, that is hilarious. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize the occasion. It feels like 20 years, David.
Yes. No, no, I think you have written for 20 years. Perhaps, I think you have.
Oh, it's the review panel that's 17. Okay, then it has been 20.
Yes, it's perfectly possible. The Artcritical is older than the review panel. And you're there, you're good. Alexi Wirth, actually, when I launched Artcritical, it wasn't going to be a magazine, it was just a personal website, a notice board for stuff I was up to. And my first thought was, why don't we just have it was the rudimentary days of HTML, but why don't we get people just to comment on shows they've seen? And I begged a few friends to help get it going. And the very first contribution by anyone other than myself at Artcritical was Alexi Wirth saying that the best show he'd seen that year was by Sarah Z. And he described it in a nice, succinct paragraph, redolent of those succinct capsule reviews that he and others wrote for the goings on about town at the New Yorker. Alexi Wirth is a painter and a writer. He stresses that he's retired from review criticism. His reviews used to appear in Art Forum as well as the New Yorker, but he's still very active as an essayist. One could mention recent in-depth looks at the work of Jasper Johns and Carol Dunham, published by Matthew Marks and Gladstone, respectively. But his principal efforts are in the studio, and he has an exhibition opening at DC Moore on January the 7th. Good. So, Lilly, David, and Alexi, good time indeed to silence your phones. Let's turn our attention to Walker and Barron. How does this juxtaposition, this collaboration work in your opinion, Lilly?
Well, just to start off with, I am an immigrant, David. You missed me.
I missed you?
I mean, if coming here at 5 counts, right? But
certainly, absolutely. Fantastic. The more the merrier. Thank you. And sorry.
That's quite all right. And the other thing is that, well, I suppose when I walked into the gallery, I was most struck by the, I guess the intimacy of it and the presentness of the work after a year and a half or so, basically, of not seeing anything except sort of, on digitalized. So, it just struck me. I have seen a few things, but it strikes me that that kind of physical presence, which they would have ordinarily, but under the circumstances, it seemed to have a far greater impact. And I was also struck by, I thought the combination seemed to work very well, but I didn't quite understand why at first, and I think it's a kind of intimacy. It took, I think, like, I don't know, if you look at Sarah's work, you might be thinking of cosmology, but in essence not. I mean, it just seems much more intimate than that. And certainly, Ron's work felt very intimate, very personal. And there was just something about the idea of technology, that this is technology of the hand, and something, as I said, we've been kind of missing, and or at least I've been kind of missing. So it just gave it, incredible force, I thought. And the arrangement, it was like arrangements of content, right? I mean, they both had that in their different ways. And then I also thought there was a kind of, in a way, a slight gender reversal. I mean, you take the clay, the ceramic, which is usually associated with handcrafting, which is often associated with women, and then and it's Ron who's a practitioner, and you take painting, and it's supposedly heroic male prerogatives, and it's become this very small personal kind of rendition. And so, and it's not like those were major things, but they just kind of added up to a conversation that worked very well. And they were both such wonderful colorists, and in a way they were a lot of the work was both made during the pandemic, so so they had that kind of well, it's not visible, but you kind of felt a certain different kind of rhythm, urgency, something that mattered, material and process.
Rhythm and urgency and things that matter. David, Brody, that characterization works for you as well. And may I ask how you felt the textures of these works were able to interact, perhaps bounce off of each other?
So it was a very bouncy room, for sure. It's a dazzling show, both works dazzling in their different ways. Sarah's work has always been intentionally dazzling, as I think you mentioned in the introduction. And she's explicitly trying to make multi-dimensional works. It's something in her statement, I'm looking for it. I'm just going to read one sentence. Fundamentally, my paintings offer visual tools for experiencing multiple intersecting dimensions. I mentioned that, I'm reading that because it relates to, in some ways, I guess, to the previous critique, and also to an artist I wrote about last year, Tony Robin, who actually made himself an expert in multidimensional geometry. But her approach is quite different and equally effective, and to my mind. And what I wanted to say about the two work interacting is that she begins with geometry and ends with chaos, or a mix between geometry and chaos, formalism and chaos. Whereas Ron in these what you call the Bayes works, I think of them all as trophies and urns, and maybe I have a chance to talk about that for a second. But they begin with chaos, broken pottery, fragments of a life, experiences, maps, figurines, little photographs. And then they are assembled into this sort of reverse Humpty Dumpty monstrosity, sort of Frankenstein Humpty Dumpty objects, which are a little bit, their initial force is sort of joyous, and so that's why you might think of them as a trophy. But the more you look at them, the more sort of manic and even angry they can begin to seem. And so maybe more like urns or somewhere in between, perhaps phases. So on the one hand, Sarah is, begins from order and goes to chaos, and Ron begins from chaos and goes to order. In that sense, they're almost the exact opposite. And I'll just stop there, I think, for now.
For now, that's great. Thank you very much. Yeah, the notion of the urn, the vase as being an urn-like form certainly plays in with makes sense of the memorial sensibility, dealing with the sort of the horrific incident that shattered literally the artist's family, and that has really informed all of his artworks since. Alexi, do you feel some commonality of purpose and subject matter and sensibility between the two artists, and how do you end up negotiating that relationship?
Yes, well, I agree with David and with Lily's comments too, but that we start out, one of the pleasures of the show, not just the beauty of that domestic, old-fashioned gallery space, as Lily had described it, but the pleasure is that first feeling of sympathy and a kind of festive, colorful, complicated, intricate, formal pleasure that we get from both works, and they ping pong back and forth. And then I think it gives way increasingly to a feeling of how different they are in something like the ways that David just began to describe. And the works kind of assimilate to one another, and then very quickly you feel you're looking at almost opposite artists. That in some ways Ron Barron's work has a kind of Rauschenbergian scavenger, finding stuff, gluing it together in a way that feels accessible. It's full of little hints and pointing gestures towards everyday life, including, I love that dangling key in one piece, like here's the key that you forgot, little moments of text, little photographs, little stacked dishes, like after a long dinner party, waking up in the morning and finding, all the dishes you forgot to do. It felt accessible, populist in the old positive sense. And whereas I feel like Sarah's in her head and in her studio, and she's more kind of like the Johns versus Rauschenberg side. You feel her in love with studio process, in love with puddling different kinds of gestures. The one thing that links them back after seeing the distinction so strongly was, I didn't see this mentioned anywhere, but it felt to me like again and again in Sarah's square panels, she was referring to the designs of tin ceiling plates, which have a very recognizable set of kind of radiating patterns. And not every piece, but a lot of them, it seemed like she was picking up and playing with that. It's not the only moment of allusion in her work, but it was one that seemed closer to Ron's sensibility.
Fantastic, yes. David, how would you respond to that?
Yes, no, I was absolutely the tin ceiling effect. I didn't think of it as such, but they are bodied forth kind of stamped metal things. And it's part of a sort of a literalization of abstraction that Sarah participates in. It comes out, I think, of, well, first and foremost out of surrealism, but then later in sort of surrealist underground and psychedelic comics and other graphic art forms. And in that sense, she's influenced by, other artists of our generation have been influenced by that work profoundly. So it's not a unique quotation, but it did make me think of Bruce Pearson's work a little bit, because she does begin with certain premises that, and also Jennifer Riley's, where there's an overlapping, crisscrossing kind of underlying structure that's laid down perhaps by pencil. You can see tiny little bits of pencil here and there. So I know that at least the geometric part, the background parts, body fourth parts are begun that way. And I should also mention, these are not simple grids, they're intersecting multiple grids and also with chaotic elements thrown on top. And so what Bruce and Jennifer do, Sarah also sometimes does, is pick out mutually inconsistent parts of those intersections to highlight or put back in space. And Sarah does something that's quite unique, which is sort of making these faux translucencies of layers so that background layers entangle with foreground layers and middle layers. And in the painting that was just shown, is that Hidden Rubble or Living Rubble, I think? All of that stuff's coming together so powerfully. I think that is my favorite painting in the show. You really are pushed perceptually to the limits of what you can digest, but not beyond. I think it really coheres, and when it does cohere in your eye, you begin to experience some kind of multi-dimensionality, which is I would say very much psychedelic. I mean, and there's a relationship there. There's one more thing I want to point out in this painting. It's hard to see in the slide, is that what look now like the foreground elements, which began as background elements, the tin ceiling thing, are fringed by these tiny white dots all the way around those black borders, which to me refer to indigenous Australian art and many other thousands of year old rock art painting traditions that is explicitly mystical, and there's a lineage of mystical abstraction in her work as well. Yes,
but not necessarily of an oceanic feeling. It's what I would see as a very strong overlap in sensibility between Barron and Walker is that they both craft the surface to the nth degree. They remain within a very, I mean, Walker especially, we see an adherence to a grid, roughly speaking, and to a logic, an internal logic within each layer, but they are both artists with what we might call a horror vacui. They don't want to leave any bit unembellished, unworked, not, I wouldn't say resolved, but attended to, and that relates to the informational overload that Walker is interested in achieving and exploring as a phenomenon in her work, but it also relates to the going over of traumatic memory and the overwhelming nature and accumulation of memories in PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And do you think, to some extent, Lilly, both artists are giving shape to a traumatic sense of the culture we're living in, or the lives that we're surviving?
Well, I was thinking of David's, comment about order and chaos, and I would think that, all of our lives are held together. I mean, it's temporary one way or the other, and how I think, that it's manifested in these works. But I just think that, well, it's not like overload. It's just trying to grasp some of all the different complications and flux, and ever more so in our lives. And I think that just by holding it for a second, then it holds it together, and then it may fall apart. I mean, there is something provisional, I think, about each of the states that we see in the works that we have, and that also, I think, combines them in a way.
Yes.
That they could be interchanged, and her patternings, or whatever, can fall apart into chaos, and vice versa, as has been mentioned by both Alexi and David.
Fantastic, Alexi, David, Lilly, thank you very much. I'm just perusing some of the comments here that Arabella von Arx thinks of Baroque hints in both artists' work. And Howard Sherman says the paintings here are very busy, polychromatic patterns that are challenging to engage. I'm trying to place them in the context of similar work. Can
I just mention, David, that I would be super curious about that. This is something that's come up, the connections, especially with Sarah's work, between a number of other, as far as I know, mostly New York and Brooklyn artists. So Bill Kamosky, as well as Sharon Horvath, maybe Barbara Takanaga, Addie Meyer, a bunch of people who show at Pierogi specifically. I would love to see a show that would try to make connections between people dealing with a kind of fetishized, super complicated pictorial format. And it's something I don't feel I understand very well. It's beautifully the opposite of Dorothea Rockburne's kind of decisive spareness of gesture. And it's very now, and I would be grateful if some smart curator would try to put together a show like that and distinguish among these different flavors of super complicated picture making.
That's a fantastic thought. I would certainly add David Brody as an artist to that mix.
May I just say, just 1 second, if you go to that Pierogi show, which has numerous artists in that category, in those categories, you could begin to do a genealogy right there very quickly.
Fantastic. One of my first articles for the New York Sun back in the day was of a big exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum made in Brooklyn. And I had to defend myself from quite a lot of feedback for the use of the term fuss and fiddle in relation to the procedure of much art made in Brooklyn as manifest in that show. And I certainly wouldn't want to use the words fuss and fiddle in relation to Walker and Barron, but there is a great deal of attending to minutiae, which nonetheless build up to a powerful structure. Good.
I mean, the thing we haven't talked about yet is pattern and decoration, which is having a resurgence and which both are connected to, but in quite different ways.
Well, Tony Robin, who I mentioned as doing 4-dimensional or higher dimensional art, began in pattern and decoration movement, just as a sidebar there.
And craft is also having a resurgence, after all of this. And de-skilling is not the way to go right now.
Yes. I'm not sure that P&D comes to my mind in relation to either of these artists. Maybe more Barron because of the appropriated fragments. So they're both, these are fragments short against their ruin. I think these are rather, I'm not sure P&D is really a point of reference I would use for them.
Well, I'm not arguing for that necessarily. I think P&D is a very baggy category and can be confusing, but I could see that people might make the connection, and I'd love to know why not to, more specifically.
Right. Arabella von Arx also mentions of Sarah Walker's work not being oriented vertically and horizontally, of being in a sort of space of its own, I guess, and therefore, in a way, perhaps helped into groundedness or tipped into groundedness by their juxtaposition with Ron Barron's sculpture. And John Monty comments that both artists seem to operate for a personal existential place, searching for meaning both internal and external to oneself. But panelists, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to leave it there because it's most certainly time for us to move on to the third stage of our review panel relay race. In the post-George Floyd world, contemporary art, like other areas and disciplines, is undergoing a new reckoning in regards to Black creators, issues and concerns. We're looking at shows of Glenn Ligon at Hauser and Wirth and Whitfield Lovell at DC Moore Gallery that could be seen in various contexts, one of which is a more healthy critical mass of shows by African-American artists in Chelsea, a sort of new normal. One can see in the same visit new bodies of work by Stanley Whitney at Lisson Gallery, Cara Walker at Sycamore Jenkins, Wilmer Wilson IV at Susan Inglet, to name a few, while the Whitney nearby presents the young figurative painter Jennifer Packer. Ligon and Lovell both directly confront historic concerns with Black identity in approaches of strikingly dissimilar texture, while true to each artist's elective process. Glenn Ligon's exhibition, titled "It's Always a Little Bit Not Yet," pursues his familiar reworking and rendering of text that entails blurring and legibility issues, requiring specific effort on the part of viewers to read its content. A text piece based on James Baldwin's 1953 essay Stranger in the Village, recounting the experience of being the first black man in a particular Swiss village, is the largest iteration of a series began in 1997, which in this instance sets the entirety of the text rather than excerpts. On another floor, Hauser and Wirth present two other series of text-based images, large red silk screens in the Debris Field series, focusing on individual letters, and neon signs that represent the transliterations in different languages of African teeth-sucking sounds. In contrast to what might be seen as a kind of structural literalism in Ligon, Whitfield Lovell opts for a more poetic and literary approach that nonetheless interweaves layers and allusions. Taking from Stendhal's 1830 novel The Red and the Black, about a socially and emotionally blocked attempt at upward mobility, it intertwines them literally in the colour of medium and support, and associatively with songs of Schubert and Nina Simone and the Black National Anthem. Tender renderings of what could have been generic portrait types of historic African Americans are artfully framed with poignant objects and materials, giving reliquary-like status to each individual image. Thank you very much. So please welcome our third panel of this lunchtime review panel. I'm joined now by Christopher Stackhouse, Karen E. Jones, and Robert E. Storr. When I described Lilly Way, and I don't retract, as a Dean of American Art Writers, it did occur to me that Robert Storr is perhaps more literally such, as a former dean, a recently retired dean of the School of Art at Yale. Robert Storr is, of course, very well known as a curator of many years standing at the Museum of Modern Art, where he was responsible for such thematic surveys as Dislocations and a wonderful exhibition, Modern Art Despite Modernism, as well as solo presentations of the likes of Elizabeth Murray and Max Beckman and others, and the series of project room exhibitions, which included Bruce Pearson, mentioned just a few moments ago by Alexi. Rob was the first Rosalie Socko lecturer, professor of modern art at New York University after he left MoMA, and as I say, after he left NYU, he went to Yale. He's a painter, first and foremost, I'm sure. And his prolific writings are being collected. The second volume is just out. Mislaid some notes, never mind. I wanted to then say that Christopher Stackhouse, Chris, you with us, I hope? Yes, well, I'm going to assume he is. Christopher Stackhouse is a writer, artist, curator, and teacher. He's recently taken a position at the University of Ohio in Columbus, Ohio, from where he's joining us this afternoon. He is co-author of image text collaboration, the image text collaboration Seismosis, and which features his drawings with text with text by writer translator John Keane. So as a reviewer, we've seen his work in the Brooklyn Rail, as well as Hyperlogic, Modern Painters, Art in America, and he's a member of the advisory board at Fence magazine and a contributing editor at Bomb. We're very pleased to welcome him. He's currently working on a book about Jean-Michel Basquiat's use of text in his paintings and drawings as literature that is networked in conceptual, post-conceptual art. And Karen E. Jones. Where is that piece of paper? Karen E. Jones.
I'm here.
Hi there. Good to see you.
Hi. Can you see me?
I can see you. I can't see a piece of paper that has my notes on it. Let me, but nonetheless, be that effortless improviser who never lets anything frazzle him, and instead look at your email, which had marvelous bullet points in it. Yes, Karen is a curator and critic. She teaches art history at the Cooper Union, and she has written, I'm proud to say, for Artcritical, and she has an upcoming publication due from the Center for Book Arts. And she also lists on her resume that she is grateful to have survived the pandemic. I think we're all grateful that you survived it too. So we're wonderful to have you with us again.
Thank you, David.
Was last on the review panel with Chris Stackhouse, and the two of them joined me to do a Zoom review panel on the wonderful, I just sit on my bookshelf here, probably come out in the wrong way around, being Black Futures, which we reviewed here on the panel. So, right, well, we got quite an order of business here with Lovell and Ligon, two very different artists, obviously. I mean, the overlaps between Barron and Walker emerged very strongly, but I think we might be hard pressed to see direct, formal or strategic overlaps between the more poetic or theatrical Lovell, the more conceptual and structural Ligon. Rob Storr, in seeing these two shows on the same street, what were your feelings of their relationship to one another?
My first reaction was just how exciting it was that they should be on the same street, that they should be simultaneous, that there were these other shows in town, and that finally we're seeing an array of and a dialogue of African-American or African artists all at once. And that's big news. And it's been growing over the last couple of years. It's not just a reaction to the George Floyd. It's a thing that's been coming and that many people have worked very hard for, but it's finally happening. And I think that was one just excitement about the fact that this was a simultaneous doubleheader event. I think, let me just go back. I remember having a conversation with Adrian Piper, And she told me that she'd once challenged Rosalind Krauss as to why there were no African Americans or African artists appearing in the pages of October or any of her books. And, what's her face said, Roz said, well, if there were any good ones, they'd be in there, right? Now we've got, she was wrong then, but she's certainly wrong now, because now we actually have competing good artists, people who are not competitors in any direct sense, but they're presenting alternative visions. And I know also from my time as a teacher at Yale, the impatience of artists of color who are always asked to represent the whole of their ethnicity in each of the things that they did, when in fact it was all of them together that did this, and they all did it differently. Now, saying that, I will double back again to personal experience. I've known both Glenn and Whitfield for a very, very long time, and since basically the beginning of their careers. And so I am very gratified to see what has happened in their work and to it in terms of its public presence. I think we're finally, again, getting to the point where you don't have to argue for the importance of African-American artists. You simply look hard at what they do and look hard at the challenges they pose. Now, in this case, the challenges are aesthetic as well as contextual or social. They're aesthetic in ways that were previously unthinkable. I can remember the squirming that went on in certain, how shall we say, critical circles, when conceptual art began to demand that people learn something before they looked or after they looked, right? Most of what they were asked to learn was based on the mute presence of an abstract form, and then it would be referred to other things. And now it's different. I mean, now it is in Whitfield's show, there is a lot of text that's audible in some cases, and it's also referred to because the Red and the Black is a very long French novel, and most people have not read it. And then in the case of Glenn's thing, there's one complete essay by James Baldwin that is put on the surface of the canvas and is barely legible, but it is in fact legible if you work hard at it. Now, again, another anecdote. I remember a long time ago, Glenn told me that when he was in the Whitney program, they were all totally politically savvy. They were all theory savvy. And somebody noticed a book by Baldwin on his tabouret and said, "Who's that?" Mm-hmm. So how racist this country was in sophisticated circles is told by that. You know, that Roz Krauss didn't think there were any good black artists at all, and that classmates of Glenn's didn't know who James Baldwin was at all, tells us that painfully, bloodily, in every possible way, we have come a long way. And I mean we, because it is in fact something that our entire country has to cope with. Therefore, it is not only about what African-American artists have done to find for them or force themselves a place in the society, but what we as a more plural audience have to learn and how much we are the beneficiaries of their efforts. So that's really where I think this show, both these shows fall down. I mean, not fall down, but land. Yes. Should I say anything more, or should I just...
Not for the moment. Hold for the next time you're called upon, because you don't want to run out, although the idea of Rob Storr running out of things to say is a challenge. But Christopher and Karen, rather than ask you for the same question regarding overlaps or not between the two, I'd like to move on for a bit and just look at Glenn Ligon's exhibition in isolation. Now this show, Karen, brings together three distinct subjects, but they all, of course, revolve, don't they, around language and text. And as somebody who has a book coming out from the Center for Book Arts, let's start. Let me ask you about legibility. What do you feel is the meaning, the value, the specific quality that Ligon is bringing out in his exploration of legibility, of transliteratability in the relation to the click sounds, in relation to the formal quality of a letter in a type, in the typographical sense. What is the let's start on the top floor, you know, there. What is the, it's a spectacular work, isn't it? This huge array of dense, black dripping barely legible, hard legible array of Baldwin's text. What is the relationship between Baldwin's text and this iteration of it in this conceptual artwork?
Well, first I'd like to say it's wonderful to see the diversity amplified in Chelsea and this dialogue between two amazing artists that have been working over the decades. They're mid-career figures. And this work has been building. I followed Glenn Ligon's work since the late 80s from the Whitney program forward, and Whitfield Lovell's work, DC Moore, 1997. So these exhibitions, and particularly speaking of Glenn's work, the text-based work, we really see an amplification of their oeuvre, of their practice, of their working techniques. And in that expansive monumental piece on the 5th floor, I believe Glenn is really taking this formula of using the text-based imagery as a means of creating a type of an archive. Rather than taking a fragment of a text and using this charcoal type of ephemeral quality, he's really using a pamphlet. He's using a type of almost like the movable text, the Gutenberg press. He's really embedding into a monumental format, much like Maya Lin's Vortex in the Vietnam Memorial. So he's really memorializing the text of James Baldwin, and he's taking a sort of universal literary approach to the personal and the social political in this piece, and really expanding upon the role of the gallery as well in using the space and enabling the viewer to experience the monumentality of the gallery space as it's evolved in the Chelsea context.
Fantastic. Yes, Christopher, the white cube really has never felt more white, has it, than on this, with this black James Baldwin Stranger full text #2 in it, really activating the unintended inadvertent whiteness of the white cube. How did you feel standing with that work in that space?
I thought it was beautiful, beautiful piece. I thought it was very potent. I mean, I found it very, very, you know, it's hard to say this. I mean, I guess the word elegant is a facile word, but I did find it both elegant and somewhat activist. I was, you know, found myself a little confused maybe around, or not even confused, but maybe even perturbed is the word, at how at this late date that you'd have to have an intervention as such to bring into focus the philosophies and concerns of Jimmy Baldwin in such a way that it would be still relevant to do so was a bit striking to me. I think it's a nice analog to have Stranger in the Village, you know, Baldwin walking through the village as one of the first, if not only at that moment, Black men to walk through the Lukerbad village in Switzerland. You know, to have that as an analog to this large-scale Black abstract, semi-abstract painting, which beneath the abstraction there's text. You know, that running analog seemed very simple and very straightforward, but effective. There was interesting that some of the words that were obscured, many did pop out, which was interesting to think about when, from an autobiographical standpoint, where he comes from, working class Black man raised by his mother. It was interesting to see, for example, there was a phrase, "Your mother was a nigger," which was very clearly rendered. Surprises in the eyes of the American white men was a phrase that was was legible. One of the things that's interesting too is that Jimmy Baldwin, when he went to Luberbad, he was suffering, on the verge of suffering a nervous breakdown, and if I'm not mistaken, he had just broken up with a white man, if I'm not mistaken, and that was an interesting kind of thing to think about in terms of the text and in terms of his place in culture at that time, and then also looking at Ligon for not an extensive period of time, but for a long time, being one of the few contemporary luminaries in the predominantly white art world. So I found it really striking and in some ways very concise. I have my kind of ethical ethical concerns, moral concerns. I don't know what the word is, but to have to use so much space and so much material to say something so succinct, I was a little challenged by that. But otherwise, I understand the market. I understand how things work, and I was pleased to be there.
Right.
Oh, can I just interject, because I absolutely disagree. I believe that the piece really needs the space to actually experience it. Not only works, it doesn't work on a textual level. It's not meant to be read. It's impossible to be read. It's invisible as far as a text. It's bringing you to the full text, which I believe the gallery should really make more accessible, because it's really a takeaway that you're supposed to, it brings you to Baldwin's text and Baldwin's experience. However, if you go back to the benches and you look at this piece in its totality, you'll see that the materials start to sparkle, they start to shine. And really this idea, and this is a quote from Walter Di Maria, that the invisible, which is the text, the invisible, which is the invisible man, the invisible, which is the Black figure, the Black subject that is unknown or is unrecognizable, is actually visible through the reading of the text and also through the experience, actually the experience of the materials that Ligon has selected in order to illuminate this piece.
I agree with that very strongly. And I think that the idea that the relation between the information that is present before you and the information which is something you have to go find or that'll be handed to you in some form does fundamentally change the dynamics of gallery going, of conceptual art, and so on. The tyranny of formalism was that you should have nothing outside of the image itself to worry about. And this is a case where you can't understand the piece, you can't understand the reality unless you go and do some homework. So the fact that you are sent back to work after you see something like this is a positive, but it's also a rather dramatic change in the structural hierarchies of power in the art world. And it puts it right in the lap of the viewer. I mean, you can, first of all, I think I agree that you should be able to get those things, pick them up the way you would a Felix Gonzalez Torres handout or something like that. That should be the way of distribution. But beyond that, you should go home and read it. Now, I read this essay 40 years ago for the first time, and I had not read it since then. And I was struck by how pertinent it was to what's going on now, how much reminders of things that one knows as classics but have forgotten the thrust of are important in cultural dialogue. Revering James Baldwin and actually experiencing and thinking about him are two different things.
Yeah.
Yes, I also believe that Ligon works in an avant-garde manner. He uses the techniques of conceptual art, of postmodernism, of appropriation, all of these techniques which you could remove a social content and aspect, but he also includes that. He includes identity politics. He includes his own personal experience as an African-American male. So I think as an artist, he's able to both straddle notions of abstraction and strategies of the avant-garde, and he's able to couple that with a political and a social agenda.
Thanks, fantastic. Now let's take Chris's concern with the carbon footprint of Ligon's Baldwin and Ligon's Baldwin, and take it across the street to Lovell's le Noir et le Rouge. Where are we with? I mean, it's interesting that, you know, a visitor to the Scrovini Chapel would be expected to have learnt their catechism before entering the chapel, and would be expected to go home and do some sort of spiritual homework afterwards. So the idea of the self-contained experience, the idealism of formalist analysis is, especially when you actually consider how grounded the formalist critics were in the best of them in the literature that surrounded any experience. But when we look at Lovell's work, we don't just get Stendhal's great novel. We also get Nina Simone and Hans Hotter's interpretation of the Winterreise. It's a heady brew. Does it send us, Chris, back to those texts and great works of music, or is it do they somehow sort of work as some kind of perfume in this work? What is the? Are they at his beck and call? Are they what was inspiring him when he was in Rome and elsewhere and making this body of works, or where do you stand in relation to the allusions and citations in Whitfield Lovell's work?
I enjoyed them. I think in many ways, I mean this in the best sense of the word. I think that Lovell's art is very pedestrian, very accessible. And I think that is necessary toward communicating with the broader public. I know that you know, with the fervor or the contemporary fervor, the fervor of the moment, so many Black artists in the galleries as artists and as gallery goers and viewers, it seems as though Black art is accessible to Black people, but that's not necessarily true. You know, in contrast to Ligon's work, I don't think that there are a great many of Black American citizens who would walk into that space at Hauser and Wirth and be able to or want to appreciate what the content is just on superficial content, surface of the content there. Whereas with Lovell's work, I think Black American families, youth, inner city people, folks that have actually felt marginalized and alienated by the practices of art in America, they feel very welcome. They would also see a history that is extraordinarily unfamiliar with the broader population of the United States. I love the dignity that Lovell's drawings bring to Black people, historically speaking, in terms of modes of dress, indicate as indices of historical time. I think that the attempts at poetics through association and allusion by the juxtaposition of objects with the drawing is relatively daring, and I didn't think that 30 years ago when I first came across his work. I was actually very impressed by that level of engagement, social engagement, and to Storr's point, and maybe to Karen's point, the information that was there is really important. On the phones, for example, the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing, is really a rich kind of grab, a kind of appropriation. You know, it's not necessarily creative, but it was, you know, the creative part is putting the recording in an old rotary phone. But and I thought that was cute. But what was even better was realizing like the information that was being distributed. How many people know that there's a Black National Anthem? How many people know that the Black National Anthem was written to celebrate the birthday of Abraham Lincoln in 1900. How many people know that that was Kim Weston singing at the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum in 1972 in the midst of thugged out gangsters, blue collar trash work, garbage men workers, the Black political class, et cetera, that those are pieces of latent history that are rarely brought to the fore in much of the artwork that we see by Black people today.
Yeah. May I get Karen's take on the legibility, the accessibility to a broader audience, regardless of color, of Lovell's work compared to Ligon's? How would you react to Chris's assertion there?
Well, I feel as though in terms of the politics of representation, I think that Lovell really does interrogate portraiture. What is portraiture? What is its role in society and within art practice? And the idea of what is a likeness, an archetype, what an imaginary figure within portraiture. And I think that speaks to his extraordinary draftsmanship, but Lovell's not presenting an individual. He's presenting more of an imaginary composite. He's representing an anonymous figure through photography. And his project seems to be a marriage of the strategy of someone like James Van Der Zee, where he is representing an individual and elevating their status and giving a positive representation to the commissioning individual. But at the same time, he's really transforming the figure. And maybe a project that August Sanders, when he's trying to represent an archetypal figure within the society. So I feel as though his project really is an interrogation of portraiture. And I think that, someone like Kandihi Wiley and someone like Carrie James Marshall, they're also representing the African-American figure, but in a very, very different way. This is really coming from a personal, memoiristic, creative procedure rather than just a demonstration of a figure of African descent.
Yes, Robert, yes.
I was going to say, I think that it's interesting. He picks up on a French novelist of the 19th century and then proceeds to do something akin to what Zola and Balzac were doing, which was to do a portrait of a social strata in individual people representing different parts of it, so that there's an overall archival project which is different from what James Van Der Zee did, because James Van Der Zee was doing his community right then and there, and Whitfield's going back and looking at the past, and he's looking particularly at the bourgeoisie, the Black bourgeoisie, or the up and coming, the arising people in this community. And that's something that we know, from photographs, if you look at photographs, but it's not something that gets represented much in the gallery or the art world. And he's spending a lot of time lavishing his attention on these quite distinctive people. Now, I'd like to take 1 second to say there was something that I saw on the show not long enough, but there was this enormous group of cardinals, ceramic cardinals sitting on a table. And I thought, wow, what the hell is this? And there's a text in the handout about the sort of his shift from accepting the blackbird as being emblematic of Black people to, and with all the downsides that has had in Disney and other people, to the cardinal possibly as being that thing there. And I also saw it as him having fun in this exhibition to a degree that's not really true of the other works. This is an artist who is striking out in a new direction, doing an over-the-top project of installation art with found objects and so on and so forth, and changing iconography. So I saw that as him breaking out of his known territory into something. I mean, there may be other things in the studio like that, but breaking out of his known territory in public into a new territory. And I thought that was very good.
I absolutely agree with what Robert said about that installation with the porcelain figures that were sort of revolving to the tune of the James Weldon Johnson Black National Anthem. I thought that was quite striking. However, the installation aspect, I was confused by it. I felt like, the Winterweiser and then that other room, it was difficult to distinguish if this was in total Gesamtkunstwerk or if these were individual objects placed together. So I thought it was overdetermined in the sense of how these different pieces were juxtaposed, but it was excellent to see that he was working in many different directions. But I think that the problem, and it's a good problem, is that he's so prolific and he's doing such a variety of different types of work. He really needs a big gallery museum space, because I think he was overcrowded within the context of that gallery space in those small rooms.
Agreed.
Yeah. Yes. But kudos to DC Moore for sustaining this artist and for giving us such a rich show. I think we have time just to peruse the comments that are coming through on this exhibition. Thank you very much, Chris, Karen, and Rob. But I'd like to bring in the audience. So let's have a quick look, first of all, at some of the things here. There is the white cube has never felt more white, somebody, Lynn Crawford, gives us in quotes. The text within the text as index of the original essay. An index, G.E. Schwartz sees Ligon's work as being the invisible, which is the text, the invisible man, the black figure, the black subject, that is unknown and invisible, is visible through the reading of the text and the experience of the materiality. Malvika Jolie, who works for the Brooklyn Rail, adds. And Barry Schwabsky, in the audience now, says, I'm intrigued by the coincidence of Karen's evocation of the invisible in Ligon's work and my mention of it in Rockburne's work, as different as they are. And Malvika thinks that's a rather great question. And Kim Uchiyama, I believe, the other person in this Zoom meeting who has a Kim Uchiyama on the wall behind her. She made it, and I just happen to have one. She says, MacArthur Binyon's recent paintings at Lehman Mopin were interesting reflections on his engagement with painting and personal history. They also employed text. In this case, his old address books. Yes, Barry Schwabsky then says, it was so much fun to read Binyon's address book and see his social network. And that's not a show I've seen yet, so off to see that as soon as possible. Carol says, for Karen E. Jones, can we say that Ligon's piece may be read in future as a universal truth in reference to the growing invisibility of our humanity? I don't ask Karen to answer that now. That's a big question for us all to think about. G.E. Schwartz again, and he seems to be claiming, this is Ligon again, he seems to be, no, this is in this case on Lovell, and he seems to be claiming that Stendhal text, reading our times in its acute awareness of having to play roles in society, the hypocrisy denoting the affectation of high religious sentiment, and those contradictions between thinking and feeling, mimetic desire in those created, realized characters. Malvika Jolie, responding to Barry Schwabsky, I'm intrigued by the coincidence of responding to that question. Okay, no, I'm sorry. Malvika is summarizing the comments as I'm doing here. And Lynn Crawford rightly points out that I'm attributing to her something I said myself. I never, when I see something brilliant, imagine that it might be me who said it. So yes, it was. Okay, well, and Malvika is re-quoting Karen Jones. Great. Audience, you've been very patient. There are 98 of you left, which is pretty good. We got 2 minutes to 3. I think we must be done by 3.
Can I make an interjection about the white cube in relationship to Glenn Ligon's exhibition, I believe that he also presents an antidote to the white. He's aware of the white cube and its overdetermination. And through his publication, which presents itself as an artist book with the collaboration of the poet and artist Greg Bordowitz, he really demystifies the art making process through imagery, imagery of his construction of these artworks within his studio. So I think that that artist book is a component that is part of the exhibition.
Yeah, thank you very much, Karen. Yes, but giving the last minute to the audience, is there somebody who'd like to share some comment with us? It's wonderful to see so many artists in their studios, and we do have one wonderful treat lined up for us, which is that we're going to have some poetry to round things off in the tradition of the Brooklyn Rails direct social engagement series. But is there any member of the audience who hasn't left a comment, or who has left a comment but wants to expand upon it in some way, who would just like to speak now? If you would like to, you need to put your hand up in the comments section, because otherwise we won't see you. There's 5 pages of you still on my laptop. So can we see Nick or
yes, I don't, perhaps I hope it's not too broad as you mentioned, but perhaps Carol, who asked the question for Karen, maybe we could
oh yes,
pass that over to you, Carol. Carol, you should be able to see a prompt to turn on your microphone. Well, perhaps let's not wait, but
yes,
maybe we'll return to that question. That the question was,
yes.
For Karen E. Jones, can we say that Ligon's piece may be read in future as a universal truth in reference to the growing invisibility of our humanity? Broad, but curious, Karen, if you have a reaction to that.
I think that that's an enormous philosophical a question to leave open, but I do believe that Glenn's strategy is one of using literature to suggest a type of universalism, a universal humanism. And I believe that he is creating a type of monumental archive in presenting that large scale work on the 5th floor.
Yes, and thank you, Carol. Look, I think actually I would love to hear, we've had a couple of hours here of very highbrow criticism. Let's round off with some poetry.
Yes. Well, I of course, I want to thank you all so much for your conversations today. Thank you so much to David for moderating this, and to the review panel. Congratulations on 17 years. But as is a shared tradition, we relish poetry, and here at the Rail, we close our community events with a poetry reading. And I am thrilled to welcome our Poet Laureate of the day, Glynnis Eldridge, to the stage. Writer, artist, and educator Glynnis Eldridge's work has appeared or is forthcoming in Blush Lit, Blazing Stadium, Glass, a Journal of Poetry, among others. She is a Pushcart Prize nominee, a member of the Lighthouse Writers Workshop, and a recipient of an Academy of American Poets, Colleges, and Universities Prize. Without further ado, Glynnis, over to you.
Everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be featured in this way. Really, it's truly a gift. I've been really inspired by this talk, and I'd like to start with a poem by James Baldwin called Paradise, and then I'll move on to my own work. Let this be my summertime of azure sky and rolling sea and smiling clouds and wind-kissed laughter, and just myself entranced with thee, and children playing in the glory of a carefree, youthful day, and sunshine shining from the heavens, and tears and sighing fled away. Let this be my happiness midst the earth's swift flowing woe. Let this be my only solace, just to know you love me so, just to know that we'll go winging far above this earthy climb, hand in hand through laughing meadows. Let this be my summertime. This is some new work that I have from a larger manuscript that I've been working on. So thank you for listening to this. How to be a person. You have the capacity to squish it all down. I could end up a chicken sandwich without accolades. I could use the internet to manifest a lover. We could have had a baby, but the closest we got to birthing was popping the massive pimple on my arm together in the shower. My foot hits the power button on all the x-rays in the condominium. Now I'm not only scannable, but the other living thing in the room. Who doesn't have it? The assumed feelings, the size of survival, paddling through the marsh paths without fear, dreams of sleeping in a big pita bed, or the hell of it, tattooing your face. What's the evidence, the assumed I'm me feeling? I forgot it all, the relief of a bug's life. I forget it all. Each memory returns once to die. The yellow of the lights in every room, the feelings of after moments of processing, the present fading, the present subtly fading, the projection of moments ago. If I'm still here and you're not, then what? Sigh of survivals, the toothpaste eating flies. Although I am an animal and you do not see me as an animal. Nature bathing in the highway's old growth forests, the tree broth. The weevil lifts from the lampshade. It returns again and again. It's a low watt bulb, but it's too hot for the bug to stay on. The weevil is trying to fly through the ceiling. It is not a sky, it's hard wood and plaster and paint. We are bobbing at the ceiling of the pond together, chugging nuclear bagels, cutting hair and watching the drakes fighting over the mallard, her gurgling pond water and flapping the surface. The drakes leave the water, waddle onto the lawn while the mallard bobs, her head underwater. He smells like air, says all duck sex is rape. I'm looking for alternatives. I follow the cow's directions and lay down in the grass. I will myself into camouflage, got gray, wanting to be green, was beige, wanting to be anything but. I thought nothing of beige and nothing of nothing. Do fireflies have a word for sex? They find each other in my bed, blinking to union. Like a long-nosed dog in a dust bath, you have a new expression for seriousness. It was me who let the devil in, my bad. The wind was yellow, not like cat skin, but light. The wind was buttoned. I asked for it, not the yellow, the movement. Forget the block. You're extremely confident for several years. Perhaps the reverb occurred. I can't swallow right. Water at the thought of day. Tell me how I annoy you. If I knew more and better, if I left and sunk in elsewhere, if then I'd shine. Sure, I could. Be confident, take the class on hitting back. Can't you see the world where you stand? The park is not immune to memory, yet the feelings you get knowing you are no longer in a period of despair. I don't want to hold your flowers too dearly. They don't mean that much to me anymore. I'm gonna stop there, so I appreciate you taking the time to listen and allowing me to close this out. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Glynnis. That was a wonderful reading and a wonderful way to close our event today. Once more, I want to thank all of you for joining us. David, Marjorie, Barry, Sharmistha, David, Alexi, Robert, Karen, and Christopher, and Lilly, each by name. I also would like to thank the galleries that were involved to helping to make today's program possible, including David Nolan Gallery, John Molloy Gallery, Hauser and Wirth, and DC Moore. We encourage everyone to view our archive of these conversations on our YouTube channel, where we'll upload today's conversation shortly. And we are here every day So join us on Monday at 1 p.m. for a conversation between artist Joel Shapiro and Rail Advisory Board member Michael Brenson on the occasion of Joel's exhibition on view at Paula Cooper Gallery. We'll conclude with a poetry reading from Hazem Fahmy. You can now all turn on your microphones, say hello and goodbye, and to wish each other a lovely weekend. So thank you all, and take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
David.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye.
Thank
much.
you, David.
Thank you,
Thank you
David.
so much.
Thank you,
Have a
Robert.
good
Thank you,
weekend.
everyone,
Thank
for
you,
joining.
Marathon.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Karen.
Robert.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
Karen.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you,
Thank you.
Karen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Happy 17th birthday review panel.
Thank
Happy
you,
Thank you,
David.
Karen.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Noir.
Lovely. Sorry, we can't crack open some.
Thank you for the reading, Glynnis.
Thank you so much, Phong.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Thank you, Glynnis.
work.
Thank you.
Thank
Where's
you.
our team?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone.
Congratulations, David.
Big program as
Thank you,
usual.
Fong
Congrats.
and Nick.
Long live Artcritical.
Long live
We're here.
Artcritical.
We're here.
Yes.
Long live our
Long live
critical.
all the good.
Thank
critics.
you.
Bye. Thank you, Marjorie. Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you all.
I almost
Have
wearing
a-
sunglasses because of the glare in my.
Have a great weekend.
Thank
We'll
you,
talk soon,
David.
David.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, David.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Fong. Nick.
Thank you all.
Wonderful to see you all. Bye-bye.
Take
Bye.
care, be safe, and
You
thank you all.
too.
Yes, have a great weekend, you all. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.